Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello and welcome to another Power Trends podcast. This is Kevin Lanahan, Vice President, External Affairs and Corporate Communications at the New York Independent System Operator. And today we welcome John Reese, Senior Vice President at Eastern Generation. Eastern Generation is an independent power producer that operates three major generating facilities in New York City with a combined capacity of approximately 2,200 megawatts. And that equates to roughly 21% of New York City's existing generation capacity. And John is responsible for new project development, regulatory and external affairs at Eastern Generation, as well as environmental compliance. John's held various different leadership positions, began his career at the New York State Energy Office before it became the State Energy and Research Development Authority. He also served at the U.S. Department of Energy, the Independent Power Producers of New York, and Orion Power, which is now known as Reliant. He's also served as Senior Policy Advisor to the New York State Public Service Commission before his time at Eastern Generation nearly 14 years ago. He's currently serving as a panelist with our own Executive Vice President, Emily Nelson, on the Power Generation Advisory Panel, and that group is charged with supporting the Climate Advisory Council, which is responsible for producing the scoping plan for New York's 2030 and 2040 emissions goals. John, welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Let's start first with what you're focused on for the company. There's been a lot of attention, especially recently, on simple cycle combustion turbines in recent years, commonly referred to as peaker plants. And these units typically operate during the most stressful operating conditions. Think the dog days of summer when there's periods of peak demand, a lot of air conditioning running. And many of these units, like your facilities, also help us maintain transmission security by supplying energy within certain constrained areas of New York City and Long Island, which we refer to as load pockets. So if you can, start for us by detailing the fleet of Eastern Generation holdings in the state, what those units look like.
So the generation fleet is Con Ed developed and divested generation. It is mature, ranging from units installed in the late 50s, 60s for the steam units, and then what are referred to as peaking units were put in the 70s after the blackout in New York City as an emergency response, specifically to solve local reliability problems at the time. So the steam units, the old Rankine cycle units, are in Astoria, Queens, as part of a huge complex that involves multiple generators at that location. And the Brooklyn assets, the peaking facilities, are at two locations, so Gowanus and Narrows, on the waterfront. And they're really unique in that they are floating power barges. I think they were constructed that way because of the immediacy and the rapid need and siting concerns at the time in the 70s. And, they've just turned out to be a pretty cool product in that they are probably one of the most responsive, resilient set of units in New York City and perhaps in the country. As we found out in Sandy, they float, which is great in a world of increased sea level rise and storm surge. They are flexible. They can move. They've moved actually a number of times over their life to different locations. We moved to Queens in the 90s. And when there was a local need, because it's sort of automatic supply that you can move in a number of days and relocate somewhere else. But as I said, the units are mature. They have, served a long and useful life. And continue to serve a reliability function. But, particularly the peakers are not the most efficient units. They've always been compliant with emissions rules, but the future presents challenges.
Yeah, so let's pick up on that for a second. So last year, the State Department of Environmental Conservation adopted a regulation that limits emissions from these peaker plants. So I'd like to discuss the impact those rules have on your business, and then maybe if you can jump right in from there and discuss with us the repowering project, which is pretty cutting edge and future forward with that technology.
the rules as they evolved and were finalized really provided us with three options. One was simply the retirement of all of the peakers, about 960 megawatts of generation on 6 power barges. 4 of the power barges are dual fuel, 2 are oil only. So we could retire them all. It's certainly an option. We could look to put controls on them that would control the amount of NOx emissions on the facilities, or we could replace them. And I would say over the last 3 years, we have been actively engaged in all 3 of those actions. We notified DEC after the rules were finalized that we were going to cease operation of the units during the ozone season, which is the period of time that the DEC rules cover, as appropriate. The oil units in 23 and the oil burning function on the dual fuel units. And then in 25, the gas units, so that they would be winter only. But we made very clear in the letter when we notified DEC that we were pursuing other options as alternatives, but this far in advance, we couldn't really say how they would turn out. We have looked at back-end controls, the second option that I referred to, and they are expensive. We are wrestling with how feasible they are to put back-end controls, basically something that would control the NOx emissions from the units and reduce them to a level so that the units were compliant. Because our units are on floating power barges, you have marine architecture as well as the basic engineering involved. So we're working on on those issues. Again, it is complex, and the units are, over 50 years old. And so, it will probably be a period of time before we resolve just how viable those options are of putting controls on. And then the third option was to replace them. As I said, we have 960 megawatts between the 2 sites. We, right from the beginning, knew that replacing all 960 megawatts didn't make any sense for a variety of reasons. One is our Narrows facility, the one furthest to the south, is actually located across the street from what has been an expanding hospital with a new children's wing that citing new fossil generation in that location, even in 2017-18, looked to be an extreme challenge. There is, this is New York, and it's in Brooklyn. Real estate has a high value. The sites are, over 50 years old, and in the case of Narrows, it was an oil terminal before that. And so the infrastructure is certainly aging and needs substantial investment. As a result of that, we looked at consolidating where our units were into one location at Gowanus, where we currently have 640 megawatts of generation. It is nestled between a sand and gravel plant, the New York City waste recycling facility, and Con Ed transmission yards. So it is about an industrial site, as you can imagine, and thus as good a location as you can find. So we did a competitive process. We entered into a contract with Siemens, and we began the process to permit new fossil units in New York City, which should make everybody cringe, because it's not a task you want to undertake lightly, or if you're of sane mind, you might want to undertake at all. But there is a need, and it is certainly, as we think, the strongest alternative for the location. And what the application includes is 2 power barges with 586 megawatts of dual fuel, simple cycle generation, substantially more efficient than the units are there, almost twice as efficient, and more efficient than the existing Rankine cycle steam units in the system. So, more efficient than about 4,000 megawatts of generation currently operating in the city, and maybe more. And in addition to the dual fuel barges, we are looking at one of the services that the current units provide, and the future units will, is black start capability, the ability to restart the electric system without an electric charge. And there are, a limited number of units in the city that can do that. And we're using batteries to do that black start feature, which is, I know of one other application that has occurred using batteries, an application in Germany. There are a couple under consideration in California, but we think it's a good fit. So part of the permitting process is including those batteries. One of the pressures on permitting a unit and ultimately deciding to build a unit will be, what is the future and anticipated life? And I think we'll probably get into this later, but certainly the impact of the state climate law, beyond the NOx rules, are a driving force on why we think the battery barges are a great solution when you look at a 2040 end date for fossil.
And that's a great segue into the next thing that I wanted to get your feedback and perspective on. But you mentioned Black Start. I just think it'd probably be helpful if we put that into some context. So I think the last time that Black Start was initiated was, I think, the Northeast blackout of 2003. And it's that kind of a situation where that functionality is crucial and critical.
Yes, the barges in that event were among the first units back and spinning. They were not ultimately engaged to restart the system because there are, multiple plans on how you restart the system depending on the conditions of the system at the time. But the existing units were ready. We think it's certainly a critical function. And one of the concerns going forward is what supplies that Black Start capability.
And certainly we think about those issues here, and the operators in the control room are always thinking about those capabilities. So you mentioned the Climate Action Council and the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019. And just as a reminder for our listeners, that's the state statute that requires 70% renewable energy by 2030 and an emissions-free grid by 2040. You serve on the power generation panel supporting the work of the Climate Action Council. So if you could tell us about the discussions so far, maybe the schedule going forward, what the focus of the panel is, and what your input and expertise has been so far.
I have to say that it is the most fun that I'm having currently at work because it's big think stuff. It is, I've had a lot of policy jobs over my career in government, and it is, I think certainly prepares me for this role in looking at, what's really important here and how do we get to these goals in a way that has minimum impact on, us as a society while having maximum impact on carbon. Because one of the things we're going to need very clearly is flexibility. As we look out to 2040, there have been a number of studies that have been done, one that the ISO sponsored, ESC sponsored, similar studies in other markets as well. And the path to 75 or 80% carbon free is knowable. You can imagine how you get there. That last piece, the piece that is absolutely right now you need magic to get there, is what's most fascinating. What is it that supplies the features that are currently supplied by, gas-fired generation? And we don't know the answer to, there isn't a good answer to that at this point. So I look at that as, how we work that through, how we accommodate that as being one of the great challenges of this process. And the other is you're really rethinking New York's infrastructure in a very rapid time frame. When you look at how long it takes to do something in New York, and particularly New York City, 2040 is now. I was talking about an Article 10 on fossil units. That entire time frame is going to take from start to installed units 10 years, 9 years. We need to kind of rethink what transmission and distribution system modifications need to happen to make this work. We need to rethink what is the gas system for. And that's one of the topics that came up this past meeting last week is what is the function of the gas system? How do you maintain it so that it is there when needed for critical resources like heating and power generation until you don't need it anymore? And is it a vehicle that supplies some of that last solution? Are there other technologies that can use the gas system, other fuel sources? So it is, there's just a wealth of questions. It is pretty uncharted territory, and certainly uncharted for New York, and it involves fundamental societal change.
The answer you gave us on the first question was a real demonstration of what the changes have been like in the city over the last 20, 25 years. Also, what the changes in the industry and the technology have looked like recently, moving at breakneck speed. So let's talk a little bit about electrification, which promises to change both things, what it's like to live in New York City, do business there, and then also, what the infrastructure is going to look like, as you mentioned. So converting the transportation system, converting building heat systems, these are the big questions, as you say, that we need to wrestle with in order to understand how we're going to get to 2040. And some studies show that we may see electric demand increase as much as a third under mass electrification. Some studies show we might even experience a reverse flow of power from downstate to upstate. How do you look at these challenges and what impact these impacts might have on suppliers like yours?
Sure. I started when I started my first job in energy, and for probably the first 8 or 10 years, I worked in building efficiency, in improving, the efficiency of the building stock in New York State. And as large as the challenges are in power generation, they are equal or greater in the building sector. That moving to electrification for heating in old building stock is going to be just a huge challenge for us as a state. And, there are a lot of people wrestling with how that is done. As we electrify buildings and increase electric demand, I think about what does that mean to the distribution system, particularly in New York City, where so much of it is underground, where it may not be adequate. It certainly wasn't designed for the full electrification of the building stock in New York City. And while we look at, what's the impact on the need for generation and needing to increase generation, one of the things that I brought up early in the power generation panel was the need for transmission distribution company involvement, because this really fundamentally restructures their role and function and the adequacy of the current system to do that. So, and we have engaged, there is a utility advisory group that's put together for this. But I think that is one of the biggest challenges on the building side, aside from the fact that, buildings turn over, they have a very long life, and retrofitting buildings is an expensive and challenging process that we need to undertake. And sort of the thing that's difficult to wrap your mind around is all these things have to happen simultaneous, and they have to be integrated so that, in fact, the electric system, to the extent distributed generation doesn't take over the world, and you need a transmission and distribution system, which I believe you absolutely do in 2040. It may be different, but it needs to be in lockstep with the modifications in building electrification and increase in demand. It needs to be in lockstep with transportation electrification, which I think by comparison to buildings, looks easier. The state has a goal for how many charging stations. It may not be, sufficient, or that may not be aggressive enough, but that's, kind of a knowable piece. If you move away from combustion vehicles to electric vehicles, you can see, at least, and maybe because I'm uninformed, it seems like an easier path than dealing with the issues of the building system and the impacts on the transmission and distribution systems.
Many stakeholders, more and more as the days go by, view our carbon pricing proposal as key to achieving not just the objectives of the CLCPA, but that advancement in the technology that we need. You mentioned battery storage, and we need that technology to evolve. We believe carbon pricing and markets can help attract that investment. Stuff that might now be in R&D all of a sudden sees a healthy investment signal. And begins to mature and accelerate. But describe the basis of support, the thoughts you have for the proposal and the benefits as you see them. I think it might surprise some folks when they learn companies like yours are supportive. So if you can explain that support for us.
Sure. First, I first worked on carbon pricing in the Clinton administration in 1994. So it was an idea I just can't shake on a solution for a problem. And I think, look, first and foremost, we've had success in the past of quantifying environmental externalities and making them part of the electric markets. It worked with NOx, it worked with SOx, it worked very well. And it did it at a cost that was well below what was anticipated by anybody involved as we made the first steps incorporating those externalities. Second, a carbon price provides certainty. One of the things, New York is, except for probably Texas, the most high-risk market you could be in. In some ways, it's more risky. There isn't a forward price signal in New York like in New England or PJM or even California in some ways. And so carbon pricing allows you to have more certainty on what your running portfolio is going to look like, what it's going to cost, what are revenues going to look like. So that's important. Third, look, I think the major fault of the CLCPA is it dictates solutions. But you can legislate policy, you can't legislate physics. And so citing just specific technologies that are going to solve our problems, frankly, I don't think is going to work. In the end, I think it's going to be new technologies and adaptation of existing technologies in different ways that is going to get us over the goal line. And carbon pricing is probably the single product that most encourages that solution-based approach. You set a price on carbon. If I can lower my carbon emissions, I have a greater likelihood of running. I have a greater likelihood of getting revenues. And so I'm a huge fan of carbon pricing because I think it takes us across the goal line by incentivizing technology innovation. And again, I think the CLCPA has dropped the ball on technology innovation.
And John, what do you say to those folks, whether it's through the discussions on the panel or deliberations with regard to the CAC, who, you talked about that last 10 to 20% of the goal, who say there's just no room for fossil fuels left on a future grid scenario.
I am not a proponent for fossil fuels as the solution here. We have certain qualities that it appears we will need that the current array of technologies are not satisfying. Look, if we had 100-hour batteries with increased power density, that might do it. That product is not here. It may be on somebody's benchtop. And so I am no particular devotee of fossil generation solving the problem. There are some unique features or some qualities in combustion units that the ability to run for a long time based on fuel supply, some of the features combining that with rapid start, that we don't have a good alternative today. And so, look, there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of talk about investment in hydrogen, in green hydrogen generated by using renewable energy to generate. Without a lot of information today, it shows a lot of promise. We'll see as it evolves on whether that, in fact, is a solution, as with renewable natural gas, which I have just a little less understanding of. But, green hydrogen, New York has a producer of fuel cells that uses hydrogen that have been operational for many years that I think are looking at expanding what they do and using green hydrogen. The application of that potentially, I think, 10, 15 years down the line looks good. But I don't know that's the solution. I think carbon pricing is what provides the promise outside of direct subsidy for solving this problem. And look, as we look at the carbon problem overall, it is a global problem, it is a national problem, and it is a New York State problem. New York State has, shown leadership in solving this problem and getting us to zero. We have set up a program that has certain incentives. We really need a national program. We need a global program to get this done. Certainly 2040, we're going to work to make sure that New York is a leader, that New York has gotten to zero. But to deal with the carbon problem overall, to deal with the impacts, we need a global solution. We need a national solution. And maybe, starting in 2021, we see some shift in national policy to help us get there. But for real technology development, we need that national signal, not just a New York signal. So I'm hopeful that we see carbon pricing first in New York, and then we see carbon pricing nationally. So that, because, as a business, I work in multiple markets, and having some fungibility across those markets is important to me. It's important to my business. So we have been a strong advocate for carbon pricing, not just here, but in PJM, where we have resources as well, and formally in New England, where we.
I have to ask, on the heels of where you ended, just your views on the future of RTOs and ISOs generally. We need to evolve, of course, and there is increased scrutiny on RTOs and ISOs broadly. Each have their own distinctions and differences in terms of the markets and how those are run in different territories. But I don't think there's been as much scrutiny and attention now that we're looking back. We can look back over a 20-year history, and now we're looking forward at a future grid of the future of RTOs. If you've got any thoughts there.
Sure. I think the creation of RTOs is one of the sort of lasting benefits of the wave of restructuring. The level within an RTO, the level of coordination of the individual utility actions of the overall electric system, and the ability to look at what future impacts are, I think has just been of immense value. As we go forward and we see this, pretty rapidly changing supply stack and transmission and distribution delivery model, I think it will continue to evolve and have that role. And I think there's going to be a great opportunity and a need for closer cooperation with the surrounding RTOs. Quite frankly, there's always been a level of cooperation, and there's also a level of separation. And I think every RTO that we've done business in believes they are the best and have the best solutions, and I always agree with them.
John, this has been incredibly informative, really interesting. We appreciate your expertise and insights, not just here, but in the governance process. You have made the New York ISO better, and I just want to thank you for taking the time today.
Well, thank you very much. This has been an absolute pleasure, Kevin, and to you and all the staff at the ISO. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and keep doing good work.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.